Hello, good evening, and welcome. I'm Simon Bestwick.
And I'm Gemma Files, and this is No
No
Darkness But
darkness
Ours.
but ours.
High five through the screen to
Yes,
England. From Canada to England.
that's the good hands across the ocean, I guess.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Yeah. So
Um,
here we are again.
yes,
Uh,
having at least one episode under our belts, our mutual belt, I guess. It's like one long belt.
belts across the ocean now.
That's it. Yeah, circumnavigating the globe. Yeah, circumcising the globe with
I
an
was just going to say that.
11-foot flipper. So, having at least one episode under our mutual belt, we are moving on to episode number 2.
Yeah.
And the topic that we chose for this week is M.R. James.
Yep. And
Montague Rhodes James.
and his influence, and which is a big, his imitators. I mean, it's a big and fruitful topic. I think, as in like the one we picked last week, it's one of these things where by the time we'll get to the end of it, we'll probably think of a dozen authors or things that we could have been discussing, and there will always be more, but that's always a good
Absolutely.
thing.
I do think that, I was answering a few questions today because I'm going to be going to Necronomicon in August, and they wanted me to do a little mini interview for the Memento book. And one of the questions was, what was your entree into weird fiction, weird as in Lovecraftian fiction? And I had to think about it because although obviously I'd come across some Lovecraft earlier in my life, by the time I actually started writing Lovecraftian fiction, I kind of had to take a crash course because I was far more I was far more familiar with people who had been influenced by Lovecraft than I was with Lovecraft himself.
Yeah.
T.E.D. Klein, or even Stephen King, some of his early stuff, like for example the story Jerusalem's Lot, which was recently made into a really, really nice TV miniseries, which manages to be about vampires and Lovecraftian at the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Chapelwaite was made into this TV miniseries called Chapelwaite with Adrian Brody. And at one point, Christopher Heyerdahl, who's this very familiar looking guy, if you know anything about Canadian film, because he is this gigantic dude, this gigantic bald dude, who pretty much looks like, I don't know, a cross between Max Schreck and Christopher Lee.
Okay.
And he's always playing vampires and ghouls and zombies and, whatever the hell. And so he shows up in Chapelwaite as Jacob, who is like the head vampire, leads this weird little Mansonite crew of, aspiring vampires and actual vampires. A whole bunch of Renfields who are, allowing themselves to be preyed on. But they also worship the worm, the god of the worm, and they're like looking to make the sun go out and eternal night descend in a very cosmic horror Lovecraftian way.
And you can see why they'd want the eternal night to descend.
Exactly, because they're vampires. But there's this wonderful moment where he gets a hold of the book that they've all been looking for, which is, of course, De Vermis Mysteriis. Of course. And he begins to read out of it, but he's not reading, he's actually singing. And Heyerdahl, because he, comes from like a Scandinavian background, I don't think he has an actual accent like that in real life, but you know. So he starts doing this thing that sounds kind of like Scandinavian plain song, but it's all stuff like
Oh man, that sounds cool.
oh, it's amazing. Yeah, it's
I'm
absolutely.
gonna see if I can find
Yeah,
that.
you absolutely should. Yeah, very, very well done. Just a mounting sense of dread, which is always what I like. A mounting sense of dread, and I'm happy.
Oh yes, I mean, I'm actually realizing I came to discover James's work really comparatively late in the day.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had read Lost Hearts in an anthology of ghost stories when I was quite young, but without realizing that's who it was by or who.
My first one was Lost Hearts too. It's
Lost
interesting
Hearts 2,
because
you did a sequel.
no, no. No, I mean my first M.R. James was Lost Hearts as well.
Yeah.
I think it's something that they put in a lot of things for kids or I don't know, like tweens maybe, because the main character is a kid.
Yeah. Yeah, which isn't that common in James's stuff, with the possible exception of Wailing Well.
Yes,
Which
absolutely. Which is not what I would start with because it's kind of considerably more funny than you
yeah.
than you grow to expect.
Yeah, until the sort of the climax when it's kind of like, oh no, he's absolutely.
That's really bad. That's terrible.
There's
Yeah,
a
Montague.
whole stuff to be had about the humour though in that story, because it is quite an ominous, slightly menacing humour because of how, there's that whole black humour of the life-saving competition, and the teachers are upset because all these kids have. But not so much because the kids have drowned, but because they've lost some of the best sopranos in the choir, and the parents aren't happy with the form letters that they're being sent and stuff like that.
It's like yeah. I mean, it is very much like the inverse of a school story. It's like a story you tell to school kids to make them laugh, but also to eventually make their flesh creep.
Oh yeah.
Old Dickensian sense.
I
just want to make your flesh creep,
But there's that recognition of the power that the teachers kind of have over it's that child. And of course, again, this was a boarding school, which is something that is something outside my experience. I presume outside yours as well. You're sort of away from your family. You're in that very. I mean, my sister lives in New Zealand, and her daughter, my eldest nibbling, her daughter's going to, is now at a boarding school because basically she has to be. I think that's the nearest kind of school she can get to.
Right.
She has to live there. But of course, I think it's a very different thing. And of course, there's stuff like Skype. The English boarding school has that, is notorious for its kind of, very, very repressed kind of Englishness.
When I was in middle school, I read a whole bunch of Enid Blyton school books back to back, which are all about how wonderful it is to go to a girls' boarding school. And as far as I could tell, it was supposed to be wonderful because you'd get the crap kicked out of you socially. I mean, nobody actually got beaten, but it was all like, and you have to be my servant, and you must curb your, you have to curb your bad habits, like your ambition or your wanting to get really good marks but only in one thing, or your lack of enthusiasm for being at a fucking English boarding school.
There would have been an outbreak of deaths by poisoning, I suspect, if you'd actually had to go to one of those places.
Yeah. Kill or be killed. Kill or kill yourself. Yes, no, I shouldn't say things like that. But it might have. Yeah,
it can be very dull. It can be a very. I mean, it's easy to. I mean, there's that Ray Bradbury. Do you know the Ray Bradbury story, The Playground? About the father who ultimately really, he's so appalled by the prospect of his beloved little son, who's a very sort of delicate, very gentle child, being put into the kind of the Darwinian melee of a playground. He ultimately changes places with them, with him. And there's the last lines of "This is hell," and no one in that hot milling heap contradicted him. You kind of wonder how many of these little monsters are all people doing the same thing with their kids.
Yeah, no, it's true.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was, because I was lucky. I was fairly precocious in my reading, for the most part. I mean, I think I've said this before. My grandfather had a huge, thick 1929 anthology of horror. So there was Blackwood, there was Bierce, there was Poe. I read the Mask of the Red Death, I think, when I was about 7 or 8. Hell of an introduction. But weirdly, there was no M.R. James in there. No Lovecraft either. I didn't discover Lovecraft until I was in secondary school. There was a copy of The Haunted of the Dark in the library, and I knew of Lovecraft mainly by reputation then. And I don't think it made that big an impression on me. Maybe because I was, Lovecraft was a writer who made a virtue out of his shortcomings, like his weakness when it came to characterization and dialogue in the normal sense. So I don't know if although I did of course enjoy The Rats in the Walls, especially when it gets to the end and that kind of long that his speech is devolving into blah, blah, blah. That is what they tell me I was saying when they found, and it's like, you just imagine somebody is there somebody there with an open, so how do you spell blah?
I think actually The Rats in the Walls might have been the one that made the most impression on me back when. Yeah. Because I had 2 collections. One was collected Lovecraft, and the other one was collected Arthur Machen. And I ended up liking Machen a lot better than I did Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Machen. I don't know which one is right. I think it's Machen.
It's certainly pronounced as Machen in The Fog, because of course they have John Houseman's little cameo as Mr. Machen.
That's right.
Tells some ghost stories. But certainly in the UK, when other people, I've been hearing other people discuss it, they tend to say it as Machen. I don't know if this is an American thing or a North American thing, Machen. I have no idea. There's probably, Google is probably our friend here. We'd probably be able to maybe find
quite probably. I will note that the Weird Studies podcast, which I would recommend to anybody, they refer to him as Machen, and they've had I think about 3 different episodes that address various issues in Machen's, sort of numinous philosophy / theory of the supernatural. The idea, for example, of evil being a sort of ecstasy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that there is very little difference between sinners and saints.
Yes. Yeah. That's sort of his nature of his conception of what sin is, what actually constitutes sin, which is very much at odds with the humanistic sort of.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, it really seems to be like, to go against nature, to go against, to be like, yes, I'm gonna have my cat talk. I'm gonna make a rose that sings.
Yeah.
I, a rose, am going to sing.
Yeah, I mean, this is a profoundly reactionary sort of view, because of course it's the time-honored kind of almost the mantra whenever anyone has tried to, whether it be abolishing slavery or whatever, or votes for women, there is a natural. If you've seen the film of Cloud Atlas,
that's right.
Hugo Weaving's character always appears as the kind of the personification of
there is a natural order to things,
and those who try to append it do not fare well. Yeah, and
of course not.
We all hear that. We all hear that claim made in one form or another, but of course it all depends. But I mean, of course, when he talks about the dog talking, I mean, of course, by the time I read that bit, I'd been quite used to reading books by Jonathan Carroll, which are full of talking dogs, and the talking dogs are really cool. What's wrong with a dog talking to?
Probably a rose or 2 singing. I can never get over the fact that Carroll once wrote a story in which the main character turns out to be death. It's like your narrator. It's like, and then of course I just did this and this and this because I'm deaf. There you go. It's like, what? All right. So
Yes.
so that's what we're gonna do, huh? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, again, Mackin and Carol are probably both worthy of a whole podcast to themselves.
Oh, absolutely.